Okay, welcome everyone. My name is Mario Novelli, and I'm the director of the Centre for International Education and co-PI of the Peer Network. Welcome everyone to week 6 of the Peer Network lecture series, The Political Economy of Education in Times of Conflict, Crisis and Pandemic, a GCRF AHRC funded network between the Centre for International Education, University of Sussex, the University of Cape Town, Nazarbayev University, Kazakhstan, and the University of Ulster, which aims to promote engagement with critical political economy analysis of education in contexts of conflict and crisis. The lecture series is also supported by UGFIET, the UK Forum on International Education and Training. All of these lectures are live streamed through YouTube and available afterwards, and will become part of a free open source resource for all those interested in learning and sharing knowledge and practice about the political economy of education. Please sign up to our CIE YouTube page and follow us and all of the previous lectures. I'm very happy to say that today's session is led by Dr. Yunus Omar and Professor Azim Badruddin from the University of Cape Town, South Africa. And the focus of this session is towards a political economy of education and conflict in South Africa. Yunus and Azim are leading in the GCRF project on the Africa Hub, and over the next 3 years we'll be doing a range and leading on a range of training workshops and the commissioning of a range of research projects around the region. Before I introduce them, I just want to briefly run through a few housekeeping rules and logistics. Please mute yourself unless you're asking a question in the Q&A. Please ask any questions during the talk through the chat function, and I will collate them and send them back to the speakers. And we'll call you back to ask the question later on. Yunus will be doing the main presentation, and both Yunus and Azim will come back for the Q&A. He will talk for around 35 to 40 minutes, and then we'll follow that with a 7-minute Sussex Buzz, where I'll set up breakout rooms where you can discuss in smaller groups some of the key issues that have emerged from the presentation. We'll then come back as a group for a plenary question and answer session. We'll try to finish promptly around 2:15 UK time. Now for just a short introduction of the two speakers. Yunus Omar is a latecomer to the Academy, having spent most of his working life as a public librarian and an English and geography high school teacher. He completed a postdoc with Professor Yusuf Syed, then Saatchi Chair in Teacher Education, and Azim Badruddin at the Centre for International Teacher Education site at the Cape Peninsula University of Technology, where he worked on a number of projects on the political economy of education in South Africa. Yunus currently teaches in the School of Education at the University of Cape Town. His research interests include teacher resistance under conditions of oppression and the intersection of history, education, and violence in societies. Azim Badruddin is Professor of Education Policy within the School of Education, Faculty of Humanities, University of Cape Town. His main expertise is that of an education policy sociologist and the enactment of education policy within education and training practice, institutional provision, and in the workplace, with an intellectual preoccupation with youth, race, conflict, and criminalization and its political economy intersections with education, social welfare, and community development. Thank you very much, both of you, for doing this session today, and also for being such wonderful partners in this great initiative that we are now undertaking. I'm going to now stop my screen share and pass over to you, Yunus, to begin the lecture.
Mario, thank you. Thanks for that very generous introduction. And thank you to everybody who's joined us here this afternoon. Our topic this afternoon is called Towards a Political Economy of Education and Conflict in South Africa. And we want to emphasize that this is a cursory step towards working in the Africa Hub on this project. And what we are attempting to do is to add an historical perspective on what political economy work in education can effect. So thank you again for joining us this afternoon. Um, in terms of political economy analysis tools and the kind of framework that that we're working in, we want to emphasize that PEA generally examines underlying factors. They may differ in focus, but we normally examine factors that shape individuals and collective behavior and political processes and outcomes. Uh, we share common components and tools across PEA analysis. For the purposes of this afternoon's contribution to the lecture series, we focus on a specific aspect of structural features of a political economy analysis, and we look specifically at looking at an historical legacy approach to education in South Africa. As part of the political analysis tools, historical analysis is part of that. And this series and this lecture this afternoon, or this contribution, hopes to add to this underdeveloped area in some form. Clifton Kreis indicates that to witness kith and kin dying of poverty is the worst humiliation. We're at our weakest, he says, and at our most powerless and vulnerable when we cannot help those for whom we care, when we cannot help those attain food, water, and the shelter necessary for survival. There's a sense of injustice and of abject failure when our children perish from malnutrition and disease, or when the old, the sick, and the innocent are left behind on roads and paths leading away from epochal violence and crisis. The role of education in the present is often framed as a key mechanism through which social solidarity can be effected, and the spaces in which that occurs are public schools, as places where foundational values and social norms are meant to be developed and produced. It is within that context then that we seek to understand the political economy analysis through an historical lens this afternoon. In terms of education, it is through education that people deal with past injustices at various levels, leading to the beginnings of healing. And so when we talk about schools in the present, our take on political economy and our particular contribution to this lecture series is to take a step backwards. We are guided by this in terms of a contribution in a previous webinar at the launch of the Southern African Review of Education special edition on COVID-19 in August this year, in which Professor Marie Brennan indicated that perhaps looking at COVID-19 needs to be looked at in its broader historical context. This particular contribution today takes that as a point of departure. So what is the origin of education in schools in South Africa? We know that the first school was established in 1658. It was a slave school, and it was a school for slaves, and it is couched in a managerial necessity frame. The person who set up the school was someone called Jan van Riebeeck. Jan van Riebeeck holds iconic status in South African history. We have a statue of him on or near the waterfront in Cape Town. And Jan van Riebeeck describes what the school was supposed to be doing in his own diary. And he writes the following in that diary. He writes, "The sick comforter Pieter van der Staal of Rotterdam," Pieter van der Staal was his brother-in-law, "has been entrusted with the task of giving them, that is the male and female slaves, instruction in the morning and the afternoon, besides his duties of visiting the sick, particularly because he, Pieter van der Staal, reads Dutch, and he reads it well and correctly. To encourage the slaves to attend and to hear or learn the Christian prayers, it is ordered that after school, everyone is to receive a small glass of brandy. These are slave children, are to receive a small glass of brandy and 2 inches of tobacco. All their names are to be written down, and those who have none are to be given names, paid or unpaid, young and old. All this is to be done in the presence of the commandant, Jan van Riebeeck himself, who will attend the school for a few days to put everything in order and subject these people to proper discipline, signs of which are already apparent. In other words, the educational foundations of the Dutch East India Company, also called the VOC, it's a Dutch acronym, at the Cape was to prepare slaves to serve their masters efficiently, and out of this emerges the ideological foundations of education in South Africa. And so the core objectives, to recap, is to re-socialize slaves, to ensure their subordinate status, and crucially, they have to unlearn what they bring in from their communities. They've got to be taught Dutch, they've got to be taught Dutch culture, they've got to be taught the Dutch worldview. They had to accept the Christian religion, and in 1682, it was made compulsory for slave children to attend. They had to go for instruction twice per week. In other words, the origin of compulsory education is for slave children to be re-socialized and to be inducted into subordination to their Dutch slave masters. Most, if not all, of indigenous history has been wiped off the map, especially the early literatures around South Africa. And what in fact sits in this literature is a European allegory of resilience and virtue in the face of the savagery of the indigene and the abomination of this creation. And so what we want to do this afternoon is to do something that says, let's take these taken for granted issues that we normally talk about as a glib sentence or two, and then we move on to an analysis of education. We want to pause a while at Jan van Riebeeck. We want to pause a while at the Dutch East India Company, and we want to pause a while at 1652. The issue of the Dutch East India Company is that in the late 19th and early 20th century, writings began to emerge explaining the origin of the Dutch East India Company and its transformation from a policy of self-defense in terms of their colonial empire seeking at that point to an issue of despoliation of the enemy, which is a crucial shift. Now, this is the Dutch East India Company that we normally recite about. In 1652, Jan van Riebeeck was sent by the Dutch East India Company to Cape Town to establish a halfway house, a garden for passing ships. The previous quotation indicates that we've got a very different view of this benevolent Dutch East India Company. When we begin to read that the purpose of the Dutch East India Company around 1603, as we'll indicate now, shifted the Dutch East India Company as a mere company from one as an instrument of commerce into a simultaneous instrument of war. In other words, in 1603, when this ordinance is passed in the Nederland, to establish the fact that the Dutch East India Company is allowed to wage war. We need to hold that into account when we think about the Dutch East India Company sending Van Riebeeck to Cape Town in 1652. This is not a benevolent commercial company. This is a company that is an instrument of commerce and of war. And so we have a very different way of looking at empire and education at the Cape. And so when we look at the introduction of formal education, it is really important for us to think about this not in isolation of the savagery and the brutality that was meted out, especially in the East Indies, around the 1620s and the 1630s, as the Dutch forced their way through Portuguese and Spanish markets in that arena and that theater of commerce, which then became a theater of war. And so the first contact then in South Africa is one of the indigene meeting these representatives of commerce and war, but it is simultaneously a moment of education. And this is something that we want to drive through this, through this presentation today. If we shift a little forward, Muhammad Adhikari indicates that as this Dutch East India Company settlement begins to articulate itself into something a lot more permanent, the colonists begin to organize themselves into what are called commandos. The first of which is organized in 1676 against the indigenous Khoikhoi of the Southwestern Cape, in which Cape Town is located. Racism, says Adhikari, was an inherent determinant in the violence visited upon the indigenous San and the Khoikhoi. In a very infamous piece of writing, commando leader Adriaan van Jaarsveld indicated, and using a racial descriptor when he does this, to indicate that there were 46 Christians and 31 Hottentots who were involved in a skirmish. In other words, we begin to see the naked racial epithets passed on to the indigene as opposed to the identities of the colonizer. In other words, racism embeds itself and situates itself as a bedrock of the inhumane treatment and the extreme violence, in the words of Adhikari, visited on the indigenous peoples of the Cape. Settler racial attitudes moved on some 150 years under colonization, and in a particularly useful insert here, showing that there was some element of pushback and always the complexity of a non-linear colonial narrative. A magistrate in Uitenhage, Uitenhage in 1805, said this with some sardonic elements present, and I quote, "According to the unfortunate notion prevalent here in my court, a heathen is not actually human, but at the same time he cannot really be classed among the animals. He is therefore," and he's talking about the defense doing this, "he is therefore a sort of creature not known elsewhere. His word can in no wise be believed, and only by violent measures can he be brought to do good and shun evil," unquote. It is clear then that for the Dutch, slaves should be educated for subservience. They should be made servile through violence, as per the commandos, etc., through the other Dutch colonial forces that then landed and consolidated the occupation at the Cape. But at the same time, schools were crucial for the establishment of hegemony and for domination of the oppressed. What's very crucial to understand at this point is that the education at this point is already differentiated between those for the white settler children and for the indigene. They are educated differently for different roles in the Cape Colony and the Cape Society. And so it is important for us to note that as colonialism embeds itself in South Africa, as we move towards the early 20th century, education by the state is only for white children, and education for the slave and the indigene and the black population is left to the church. And this is a fundamental point that we want to return to later. However, as apartheid consolidates itself, there's a radical shift in the way the state begins to shape itself in relation to education. As race is inscribed on the South African landscape after the coming to power of the National Party, education is now seen as a direct and fundamental process of subject formation, according to Sodin. in contrast to the earlier period when it was actually not a priority of the state. In other words, here, the state no longer leaves education for the native to the church. It takes education as central to its ideological state formation. And so we can look at South African history and say, well, they were written out of history before the indigene, the slave, and children born into that kind of society. But this was hardly the case, and part of coming to terms with this history is a small but burgeoning literature that begins to isolate and begins to articulate a counter narrative. So in Cape Town, and we focused on Cape Town because we looked at the settlement, the first colonial settlement in South Africa being in the Cape. We look at, in 1937, for example, the emergence of something called the New Era Fellowship. This is taken from a new text by Professor Crane Sodin called The Cape Radicals. The Cape Radicals drew largely on immigrants from the north, fleeing pogroms, etc., from Russia, Lithuanian Jews, etc., settled down in Cape Town, and what they formed, what these people in Cape Town formed, was an alliance of ideas with people coming in with sophisticated views of socialism, etc., a new thinking about how human beings can transcend the labeling that is inflicted on people across the world, but more particularly as we speak about Cape Town in South African circles. This New Era Fellowship begins to disrupt prevailing ruling class thinking in the most sophisticated ways. Who, you may ask, is this New Era Fellowship and the people associated with it? Well, outside of the Cape Radicals and a few theses, nothing much has been written about these people. Crane Sodin writes, and I quote from the text, none of the major histories pays it any attention whatsoever. And that forms part of the kind of issue that we are attempting to address today. This absolute amnesia about historical thinking into the present as it may influence what we attempt to do to set a world that is absolutely inverted in terms of justice. The important issue here is that the New Era Fellowship composes largely but not exclusively of teachers. These are teachers drawn from the black and colored classes. And what they do is that in their living, in their daily living, they exemplify the discarding of racial identities. They attempt in their work, in their writing, and it is extensive. They attempt to show that it is possible to live as a full human being without the epithets of racial savagery inflicted on them. There are, of course, contradictions, and I hope that this will be picked up in the Q&A about the role of teachers and the class formation and their alliance to the working class from which they spring, but their burgeoning emergence into the middle class. Is there misrecognition? Is this movement then doomed to fail by virtue of its misrecognition of its entry into the middle class? Of course, what then happens is that ideas like these, anti-racist ideas like these, coalesce. They move sometimes in very contradictory ways with major movements like the African National Congress, the All African Convention, etc. And what then happens is something that much of the world was witness to. Those of us who saw this at first hand witnessed that, but we were not able to see this.
I've been lenient and patient. Don't push us too far. Don't push us too far.
Good evening. A general state of emergency has been declared throughout the country. state of emergency took effect at 1 minute past midnight this morning. This afternoon, the state president told a joint sitting of the three houses of parliament that he'd taken this step because he believed the ordinary laws of the land were inadequate to maintain public order in the prevailing circumstances.
The measures published today give wide powers to the security forces. They are empowered to enter premises without a warrant and take steps they deem necessary for the maintenance of public order or safety. A ban has been placed on the taking of unrest pictures without the permission of a commissioned police officer.
As this steps up, and this is in 1985, 5 years hence, we enter a period of the release of Nelson Mandela from prison. We see the release of many of the ANC, persons in prison, of the Pan-Africanist Congress, many of them who still languish in jails. Azapo cadres, etc., are all released on February the 2nd in a major pronouncement. This moment signals, in terms of the hope for South Africans, the possibility of emerging into a world, in the words of the NEF and people like those elsewhere, of being able to say that we can emerge as full humans, realizing our full human potential. Instead, and we hope that this will be debated in the Q&A, we have a rainbow metaphor. What rainbowism does in terms of Sodin's writing is that it embeds the idea of a South African identity in the post-apartheid era, still only being available in stark racial terms. Now, it's important to understand that an historical political economy analysis of education in South Africa notes that this rainbowism and this still clinging to race is prefigured in narratives of Van Riebeeck, of Rhodes, of Jan Smuts, Hendrik Verwoerd, Foster, P.W. Botha, F.W. de Klerk, etc. What we've got to understand is that writers, for example, like Thiel, who was one of the great historians of education, of social history and political history in South Africa, indicate that it's not nice to speak about, it's not pleasant to speak about black and white relations. Yet that language carries over into the new South Africa, because we carry black, white, Indian, colored, etc. into the new South Africa. Arguably, we've got to be able to understand very, very clearly that the current narrative of South Africa, as it attempts to wrest its way out of the enormous challenges, is beset with a basic problem. In that, and I quote Sodin, the current narrative of South Africa rests on this basic algorithm of race that has been inscribed on us from 1652. Clifton Chris indicates that it's very nice to think about rights, and it is useful to think about rights. These are largely meaningless in a world of systemic insecurity. He argues that the world that we've inherited, this world of poverty for the vast majority of black people in this country, didn't emerge out of nowhere. It emerged out of early colonial rule. Violence produced South Africa's first poor. And what we've got to think about is that if we ignore violence and simply reduce it to a sentence or two and then move on in our studies, we are missing a huge, huge, huge lesson from history. We've got to be able to think, says Kreis, that a history of violence recognizes first and cherishes the thousands who perished. Secondly, a history of violence and a recognition and insertion into our work also recognizes the world that is bequeathed to us by that colonial violence. Thirdly, says Kreis, a history and a cognizance of a history of violence offers us alternative ways of thinking about the past, about land, about politics, about history, and about moving forward in a post-South Africa, in a post-apartheid South Africa, to the ideal society that we all wish for in South Africa and beyond. Is the past irreversible, or are we going to retain our ideological blinkers in terms of the non-interrogation of race as a key marker of what it is that South Africans identify themselves through? Nico Smith indicates that Hendrik Verwoerd, who became the Prime Minister of South Africa, indicated that he wanted to implant the concept of apartheid so deeply in society that no future government would be able to undo what had been done. That is our challenge, and thank you for your attention. Thank you very much.